In this lesson, we're looking at how you record a macro. Now, if you're new to the world of macros, they are simply a recording of something that you perform in Excel that can be played back. There may be an occasion when something that you do every single day, you would prefer to record doing that task and then play it back every day to save you having to repeat the same moves again. We'll demonstrate this with a very simple macro. For example, we may want to set up the page settings for our sheet, the paper size, whether it's landscape, portrait. We also want to include some page numbering in the header and footer. We can do all of this setup by recording a macro of us doing this, and then when we've finished, we can then run that macro to always set those print settings correctly in any book that we open up. So to begin with, the macros you'll find on the View ribbon, and you'll see over at the far right there's a button called Macros. Now if I was to click on the button itself, it will display the macro dialog box and show you any recorded macros you have. Now here you can see we don't have any, so we're going to record our first one. Let's close this box. Now to record a macro, we click on the drop down beneath that button. Here you can see we can choose record macro. When we click on record macro, it brings up a dialog box and it's asking for a macro name. Now the names can be called anything, but they cannot have spaces. So we'll rename this one page layout. So I've typed page layout all as one word. It then says, would you like to have a keyboard shortcut? Now that will save us having to click on a button or attach it to a menu or a button. We can use a keyboard shortcut, and for this you click in the little box. Now ideally, to set up my page layout, I would like to have the letter P. Now at the moment Excel has already allocated the Control P keystroke to the print preview, but we can still use the letter P by doing Shift P. That will make it a capital P. So I shall hold the Shift key down and hit P. There you can see when I come to play this back, I would hit the Control Shift P keystroke. We then have this option where it says you're about to make a recording of a macro. Where would you like it to be? Now in the drop down you have three choices. The top one, personal macro workbook. If ever you want to have a macro that can be played back in all future workbooks, then you would always record it in this personal macro workbook. You have new workbook. When we start recording, Excel will create a new workbook and put the recording in that book. We don't need that one. The last one is probably the most common one, which is this workbook. In other words, I only want this macro to work in this particular book. Now, most of the time, that's what you want. You may have a macro that you've recorded that filters a table or creates a chart or a pivot table. Now, those you want to work in the book that you're recording these, because that's where your data is. Now, for this example, we will keep it in this workbook, but because normally page setup we would like to work in all books, we would normally record it in the personal macro workbook. So just bear in mind that just for this exercise, we're going to keep it in this workbook. The description is optional. You can type in what the macro does. Now bear in mind, when I click OK, the macro will begin recording. And it will record mistakes as well. And this is why most developers would normally rehearse what they're doing so they know what they're doing, where they're going to click, so that they don't make any mistakes during the recording. So I'm going to click OK. We're now recording. So I want to set up my page layout. I'm going to go up to Page Layout ribbon. I want to first of all set my paper size. Now we want it to be paper size of A5. For this particular setup, we want it always to be on an A5 sheet of paper. We also want to set the margins to narrow. So I'm going to set them to narrow. The orientation we shall leave as portrait. But we do want to put some headers and footers in as well. Now we can do that quite easily by clicking on the Print Titles button. And we go to Header and Footer. And we want to put some page numbering at the footer of the page. So we come down to the footer section and we can choose page 1 of question mark, and it will display page 1 of 1 at the bottom. We click OK and we can stop recording. Now to stop recording, the easiest method is to choose this tiny little square down on the status bar that we can click on, and that will stop the recording. Now we can test this to make sure it works correctly. If we put a new page in, if we look at the settings, the paper size is currently A4. Let's change the orientation to landscape. The margins are currently normal and there's no headers and footers. So if we were to run our macro, it will perform all those changes we recorded. If we run the macro, it will set up all those settings we recorded earlier. Remember, our keyboard shortcut is Control-Shift-P. So if I do Control-Shift-P, you'll notice that some things have changed, because if we now go into paper size, it's now A5. The orientation is back to portrait. And if we go into print titles and header and footer, it's put the footer on as well. And that's the basic macro recording.